today's webinar. So welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining today's webinar for STEM graduate students, Demystifying Mental Health Support. And before we get started, a big shout out to our producer, Ruth Tessema. Without her, we wouldn't be able to have this webinar and to bring together experts to have a conversation about demystifying mental health support. This webinar is co-hosted by the American Chemical Society and was co-organized by ACS in conjunction with the American Geophysical Union, the American Physical Society, the American Society for Biochemistry and Molecular Biology, the American Society for Cell Biology, and the Professional Development Hub. Today's webinar is the second in a series of virtual events that focuses on mental health and graduate education. The very first event was tailored for faculty and administrators and focused on the recently released National Academy of Science report on mental health, substance use, and well-being in higher education. No worries if you missed this first event. Here is the link to the recording and the slides. If the chat worked, then you should have now the link. I hope so. And also, Tracy, do you see actually my slides? Can you give a thumbs up? Okay, awesome. So the last event was for faculty and administrators. Today, this event is for graduate students. I'm Jörg Schlatter. I'm the manager of the ACS Student and Postdoctoral Scholars Office and today's moderator. I received my PhD in chemistry many, many years ago in Germany. And for a long time, I talked to peers and friends and graduate students and postdocs. It became quite clear that grad school can be a unique and rewarding experience. All graduate students from chemistry, geosciences, physics, and biology have the goal of getting a master's or doctoral degree in common. Other factors vary and holistically provide a unique combination for every individual. For example, students arrive at grad school with different motivations, different strengths, and values. Often they left their hometown, or in my case, even the home country for grad school. They become exposed to a new culture and a new environment, possibly. During grad school, well, students deal with coursework, do challenging research, present and discuss research results and conclusions, and have to take all kinds of hurdles. Their advisors, mentors, and peers, and university staff have different personalities and histories, which can certainly impact how a student feels. I don't know any student that didn't have to deal with some kind of rejection during grad school. For example, if a manuscript didn't get accepted by a journal, oh my God, I don't want to think about that time back then. And on the other hand, students publish their work. They might receive awards and have the opportunity to expand the network with wonderful people. And on top of these impact factors in grad school, there are those that come with a regular life. Your family, your significant other. You might ask yourself, even, should we start a family? Or do I really belong here into this grad school, to that university, to this particular environment? At some point, you will ask yourself, I need a job. What can I do? And maybe even reflecting on what is my purpose. So for sure, there are a lot of stresses associated with the time in grad school. Being able to analyze your own well-being and if necessary, to take steps to get back on track is critical. Today, we will discuss common mental health challenges for STEM graduate students, focus on strategies for managing your mental health, which includes seeking professional help. We will touch on and off-campus mental health resources, as well as strategies for accessing care. Some housekeeping items. Thank you for submitting your questions during the event registration, We will attempt to provide as many answers as possible today. If you have additional questions during our conversation, please submit them through the Q&A function in Zoom. We will share also our resources and material with every attendee in the coming days. But now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our experts. First, Dr. Nancy Roy. Dr. Roy serves as the Chief Clinical Officer of the JET Foundation and is an Assistant Clinical Professor at the Yale School of Medicine. She has over 20 years of experience as a psychologist working in college mental health. Through her work with the JET Foundation, Dr. Roy has worked on mental health initiatives with the former Surgeon General, the Higher Education Mental Health Alliance, the Department of Defense, the Veterans Administration, the Clinton Health Matters Initiative, and college and university systems across the country. Welcome, Nets. And of course, Dr. Tracy Calandrillo. Dr. Tracy Calandrillo is Assistant Vice President of Campus Life at the American University in Washington, D.C. Dr. Calandrillo leads a team of departments focused on health, well-being, student engagement, and international student support services. She is a licensed psychologist in the District of Columbia, and prior to her current role, she served as the executive director of the Counseling Center after many years providing therapy and supervision in various staff psychologists and leadership roles. Dr. Calandrillo was a founding member of the Higher Education Mental Health Alliance and has served as a past vice president of professional practice for the Society of Counseling Psychology. Thank you for being with us today, Tracy. Let's start our conversation with common mental health challenges for graduate students. And Nance, I might ask you first, in your experience, could you describe what are common mental health challenges for graduate students in STEM?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And it's always a challenge to start out with bad news, but the reality is, we have found, and the research clearly shows that graduate students struggle much more significantly with mental health issues than their peers who are not graduate students. 1 in 2 PhD students definitely report psychological distress. That's pretty significant. That's half. And 1 in 3 report being at risk for more significant mental health issues. Depression and anxiety are the 2 primary clinical issues that graduate students struggle with. And that's not unlike undergraduates as well, but the graduate student challenges are obviously unique and can often result in not only distress, but actual mental health diagnoses such as depression and anxiety. There's a number of reasons why, that contribute to mental health that I'm happy to talk about now or wait till later.
I think at this point, we might want to give Tracy the opportunity to chime in.
Sure, thank you. I'm so glad to be with everyone today. And just to kind of extend some of that initial information, I think that one of the pieces that is in that landscape of graduate school that is inherent for everyone is it's both an opportunity, but an incredibly challenging and provocative opportunity. And York, you really laid that out really well, what some of those challenges are. And so throughout our conversation today, I think I'm going to continue to build in a message of how important it is to have a mindset where you build in this understanding that being in a graduate, especially a STEM program as a graduate student, is inherently challenging. And yes, it's supposed to be hard, but in addition to that, with anything that we move into that is particularly challenging and provocative, is to tend to our own health within that. So if I was going to run a marathon, for example, I would know that might be challenging for my body. So I need to prepare my body for that and look at the obstacles of taking on that kind of challenge. And so, as Nance was saying, when we know that this is, that graduate students do tend to struggle more with mental health concerns than non-graduate students do, the message that I would want to send is, how would we prepare for that? Or what are the things that you want to really notice for yourself that are signs that you might want to look at either managing your mental health differently or seeking support?
Thank you, Tracy. I know I get that question all the time. Yes, we're in grad school and it is stressful, and we notice stress actually helps us sometimes to live up to the expectation, right? But there is certainly a threshold associated with stress which is not healthy. Do you have any advice or any comment on that particular threshold? What should students look out for where they might need some kind of support? And Tracy, do you want to go first?
Sure, yeah, glad to. Well, I think any of our answers today, we're probably going to have some kind of caveat that it's really important you know yourself. And so you're attending to what are your strengths? What are the things that are more difficult for you? Often for graduate students, they've gotten a pretty good sense of how they study and in what ways academic stress can play out for them. But what I've often found when working with graduate students is some of those academic stressors are things you've never had before. It might be, you mentioned writing a manuscript and getting into a process. I think that goes to a different level. And so for all of us, there's a certain stress inherent to not knowing things or doing things we haven't done before, not knowing what to expect or how to manage that. So you're to your point of like what that balance is am I able to generally cope with what's coming my way and continue to do the things that I need to do, whether that's focusing on class, paying attention to the research projects that I'm doing, take care of myself outside of that space. That's a different way of thinking than what I often find undergraduate students are struggling with, which is some of those more basic, like paying attention to finals, but kind of getting through them and moving on to the next thing. I think that challenge is more intense for graduate students. And so being aware though of, are you able to do those basic functions and still be able to perform in your graduate program?
Excellent.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I would just add that, I think we're trying to distinguish between, we know it's hard, and what is sort of the normal level of stress that you would expect to experience. But then what are the signs when it's moving toward a more troubling situation? And those can manifest themselves in different ways. But often, if you think about sort of your regular daily functioning, is your sleep becoming impaired? And we're not just talking about for a couple of days when you're trying to finish a project, but, in the long term, is your sleep impaired? Is your diet suffering? Are you as much? Are you not exercising? Are you not taking care of yourself in the ways that you normally would? Are you turning to substances for coping? So, as you notice things that feel like a little like an anomaly to your regular way of functioning, that's when really you need to take stock, and notice those signs not only in yourself, but hopefully tuning into signs of struggle in your peers in a way that might be helpful to them.
Thank you. So long-term significant changes could indicate that there's something what you have to address, if that's what I really heard. Yes. And if that's the case, are there things what students could do on their own? What should students really try to explore to help themselves prior possibly to reaching out to professional help? Is there anything what you could share with us? And maybe we go with Nance first.
Yeah, so there's so many things out there now. Mindfulness is like a catch-all for so many things these days. But honestly, the science does show that mindfulness is a wonderful practice to incorporate into your daily living. And there's so many apps out there now that make it actually quite easy, even as little as 5 or 10 minutes a day, to take some time out to either do some meditation or yoga or breathing exercises. I mean, there's such a repertoire of opportunities to practice mindfulness. There's really probably something to fit pretty much anyone. So that is one thing. The typical things that we talk about are, diet, nutrition, sleep, exercise, and that's easier said than done. I often preach it and don't always practice it myself successfully. So those are sort of the basics. I think one of the other things that can really be helpful is to recognize that, perfection is generally not attainable, and to set realistic expectations for yourself, and thinking about the wholeness, if you will, of your life. Thinking about what can be your work-life balance, especially if you have a family or you're caring for, other people in your family. It's setting realistic boundaries and expectations for yourself, and then communicating those to whether it's your mentor or an administrator at your university, but being clear about what you can and can't do, and having that conversation in a very transparent way to hopefully negotiate a reasonable work-life balance for yourself. So advocating for yourself, I guess, is a way to sum that up, in addition to some of the other things that I mentioned.
Tracy, do you want to add something?
I would add one piece. I think Nance really, that's all the things I would want people to start with. She mentioned one other piece I would add. I find that for graduate students, often, it's not always, but often they're moving into a new situation where their peer relationships are maybe not established. And sometimes in some sort of departmental subcultures, there's not necessarily a culture of mutual support and collaboration, but it's also really important to continue to have relationships with people, especially ideally people who know you in a different way than being, the PhD student in the chemistry department, or the person who's working in this lab and is in this kind of space doing this kind of work, because all people have multiple facets to who they are. And graduate school can be really provocative to some sense of social comparison or comparison to others. And so being able to balance, I'm working in this space, I want to get this certain kind of grant, or I want to be seen as the person who's competent, needs to be balanced with people who know you in a different way, and ideally in a deeper way, where your sense of being a good person, or a person who's doing things that are positive, isn't just based on the sort of last performance that you had in your academic program. So in terms of going back to your original question about what might you do before you go to therapy, it might be to take stock of, do I have the kind of supportive relationships in my life that really encourage me to be my full self?
Yeah, and I would just say, Tracy, that's an excellent point, because we know that a sense of belonging and connection is a protective factor for mental health. It's one of the most significant protective factors. And when you, as you alluded to, in many departments, the competitive nature of the work, vying for grants, vying for research stipends, vying for projects, is not conducive to developing a culture of belonging and connection. So absolutely needing to find that, if possible. I mean, I often am accused of being a glass half full person, and sometimes too idealistic. But in our report that just came out from the Council of Graduate Schools and JED on graduate student mental health, one of the things we really are recommending is that senior leaders take a look at the structures and the competitive nature of academia, and really try and rethink those structures to develop more compassionate and connected communities.
So
Can
I
I
have
just
to
add one point? Just one point that I thought that just to reinforce, I think especially for our graduate students who come from underrepresented groups into the graduate student space, this is essential. So, you know, if you're a person of color and you don't have peers in your program who look like you or come from similar backgrounds, you're in a space where those aspects of your identity aren't going to be brought into the experience in that same way. And that can really have an undermining effect in ways that you might not be conscious of, because it might not be the first time that you're the only person who looks like you, or you're the only person who comes from a certain experience. I just really want to reemphasize then how important it is that you make space for your full identity if it can't be in your cohort or in your program.
Excellent. 2 comments. First, as a reminder, we will send you resources, and that resource list will also include the report Nance just mentioned from CGS, the Council on Graduate School. So please submit your questions via the Q&A function. And I know that one question is very, very important. How do I communicate actually mental health issues to my PI? I would like to reserve this question for a little bit later in our conversation. Instead of focusing on that question, I think we talked a little bit about what we could do for ourselves, but now we know that universities and academic institutions have also mental health resources on campus, and it varies very likely from institution to institution. But I would appreciate if you could share with us what are common mental health resources which could be found on campuses throughout the United States. And we might want to go with Tracy first.
Sure, yeah. So again, start with your institution, because we want to make sure that you're taking full advantage of the resources that are at your institution. So by and large, most institutions have some form of a psychological services counseling center department. Usually that's located in a student affairs division, an office of campus life. The purpose of why universities have this is because we know that mental health support is connected to student success. So it's in a university's interest to have some resources for students. And at the same time, those resources aren't meant to, for some individuals, be the only thing that they might need. By and large, those resources are either at a greatly reduced cost, or they're free in the sense that your tuition dollars are already paid for them. So I really encourage, if you're thinking that you might be interested in learning more about therapy, to start just with your university's website. You can either, go to the kind of student affairs or campus life section, click on the counseling services department, and almost all universities now have some sort of descriptive website that has that information. And the reason I say start there is because you're going to need to ask some questions, and I can imagine we would go into this in more detail if people are interested, but ask some questions of yourself and then what the service offers to see what kind of fit is there and what's going to make sense for you. So some of you may have had therapy before. You may have some specific things you'd be looking for. You would go to the website to see if the center offers those things. If you've never done therapy before, it's usually a good starting point to understand sort of what is available through my university, so you can develop your own sense of, is this what I'm looking for? Then lastly, I'll say some universities, particularly larger universities, have multiple places where you can go to get services. And it's best to start with that counseling center option, but know that sometimes it could be like a psychology department clinic that offers additional resources, or if you were looking for a certain type of support, some universities, even their art therapy program, might offer resources. So try to be open to what's there, but I would say start with some version of the counseling center or health center as a way to understand what's available there.
Yeah, I would just, one other place that often in a large university, as you mentioned, Tracy, the medical school often will have a psychiatry department that also offers services. But I agree, starting with your counseling center, even if it's just for information. we've heard in the report that Jed and the council did on graduate student mental health that many graduate students are apprehensive about going to the counseling center for a couple of reasons. One is their hours are typically, strictly 9 to 5 or 8 to 4, and that's not always conducive to the graduate student schedule. And the other barrier, if you will, is some apprehension about potentially running into undergrads that you are TAing for, supervising in some way. And so those barriers are real and certainly understandable, but it's still a good place to go to get information, because the counseling center, if nothing else, can help you get connected to resources in the community. They typically know good providers that are out there that know the student population, that know what those challenges are. And many campuses now, in addition to the counseling center, have care managers. And sometimes they're located in your department or in the dean's office. And those care managers, their role is to help you find a connection in the community, who has a sliding scale, all the sorts of things that I think we're going to talk about in a minute. So I'll pause for that question, but the care managers are another good resource for information.
The local resources are very helpful for graduate students, but if postdocs are in need of those resources, don't shy away. Ask if you could really take advantage of those resources as well. And if it's not possible, well, ask your postdoctoral office if there's something what could be implemented to allow access to those resources for you, the postdoctoral researchers as well. Also, the postdoctoral association can certainly help to negotiate and provide access. Right. I see Tracy had her finger.
Yeah, I do, because that actually is a really good point. So postdocs are often considered employees of a university, which means you have access to the resources that all staff at the university do. And many universities now work with what's called an employee assistance program. And often these are mental health providers or companies that do, offer a whole range of services that are available to you as a staff member. So that's a really good point. And I think you might not feel comfortable when you first start your postdoc asking those questions. But again, a good place to start that people don't need to know that you're looking at are the resources that are on the HR website. Most postdocs go through some sort of like new employee training. Most HR departments are going to talk a little bit about those support services. So that's another really important place to start as well.
So I could imagine that one barrier for students is simply, I don't know what such a counseling session would actually look like. I'm wondering, could you give us any idea how a counseling session could look like? How long does it take? What are session formats? Which type of questions are you asked at the first visit? And maybe we start with Tracy.
Sure. Yeah. So I used to do kind of when I was a therapist, and I would start in that first session, kind of offer a little roadmap of what to expect in the session. Let me say that most people, not everyone, but most people have some trepidation going into talking to a therapist for the first time. It's very different than, especially in the United States, the way we think about talking about ourselves. And it's also very different than kind of your first time going to see a physician for a physical, where you gotta know what you're going to be asked about. So, give yourself a little bit of space to be compassionate, but often the session is going to be a lot of questions. You'll probably complete some sort of questionnaire at the beginning, because there is an element of it that is acknowledging that you're going to be in a conversation with a treatment provider. They're going to go over with you some of the limitations that go along with that. And then ideally the conversation would have a balance of the therapist getting to know you a little bit, asking you about what's bringing you into that first session, with also some questions that they're going to need to ask everyone, no matter what the person comes in for. And that gets to, I think, one of the points that Nance was making about what we often see for people who come in to speak with a therapist at a counseling center, which is what's going on for the person, and the therapist is going to be listening for how can I start to think about recommendations that I might make for this person in terms of the type of treatment that they might need. And so we know that anxiety and depression are very common. So a therapist in that first session will be asking you questions to better understand how you're coping and what's going on for you. I think it's reasonable to expect in almost all of those kinds of sessions, it's going to end with some ideas about what would happen next. So it might be that you have another session with that person. Most often is what is offered is some suggestions about what you might get out of doing some more ongoing talk therapy. Sometimes the session will include other resources that are available at the university. So for example, in the counseling center where I've worked, we have a very large group therapy program, which is often kind of scary for people to think about at first, doing therapy in a group, but an incredibly helpful way. I actually led a graduate student group for many, many years, and it was a very, very good experience for the students. So you'd just be learning about what the options are, and hopefully have a chance to ask questions about that. And then that would be the end of that. And then you'd kind of go from there and thinking about what you liked about what the options were.
You're muted.
I would just add, that's an excellent description, and I think, very thorough. I again would just add to be realistic about the expectation of that first session. You won't come away likely with the answer to your issue, right? So this is a process, and the process may be a handful of sessions. It may be that you engage in a long-term talk therapy or medication or what have you. But that initial session is really meant to, as Tracy said, identify sort of what's bringing you to, what's your presenting problem, what's bringing you to the table today, or maybe I should say the couch, I don't know. And then, a really, for most people, it will be a detailed history taking, questions about who you are, your family, your significant others, the challenges you're facing day to day, sort of where you came from and how you grew up and how that's manifesting today. And really the clinician is trying to, as Tracy said, get as good a sense of who you are, both historically and presently. And then by the end of the session, you really should expect that the therapist would be able to say, so this is what I heard, and this is what I think, correct me where I'm wrong, because clinicians are not perfect either. And so, as I always used to say to my patients when I had a private practice was, take what I say that fits and throw the rest away. Something's going to resonate, and that's what you go with. And some things will maybe just fall flat, and that's fine too.
Thank you. So I know, even including myself, I'm hesitant to go possibly to a mental health center, knowing that everyone on campus would know that I would take advantage of the services. Can you talk about confidentiality? Maybe Nins?
Yeah, so, I guess that's a two-pronged question. I mean, medical records are confidential, right? They are not shared. They're housed in the counseling center or the health center or the medical school, wherever you're being seen. And if you want your record released, you specifically need to give written permission. So the records are confidential. It doesn't go to your department or your PI or, anywhere unless you request it to go somewhere. The piece that I mentioned earlier that you can't control is if you go to the counseling center and you see people that there, undergrads or what have you, then they're going to know you're going. So if that's now that they're not going to know what you talk about in therapy or what issues you're coming, to try and get some support for. But there will be some visibility, shall I say, to whomever you might run into at the counseling center. But the records and what you talk about are protected. They're protected by FERPA, by HIPAA, depending on the setup of the organization. So, so that should not be a barrier, but understandably, I worked for many years also at a very prestigious university in their counseling center, and many of the graduate students especially went on to careers in politics or, very sort of high profile, and they were always apprehensive about what if someone found out that I, came for psychotherapy. And it's an understandable question, but it does not get revealed without your written permission.
I think Tracy brought up earlier that everyone comes with a different background. And we know that about 50% of graduate students, and even more in the postgraduate world, are actually from abroad.
Mhm.
And reflecting on myself, when I started my work in the United States, language was a huge barrier. So I really had to work hard to get my research straight, and I was scared to talk to anyone else about anything else. So can you talk a little bit about if the mental health services are typically set up to work with individuals from different cultures who come with a different native language to a campus here in the United States? And Tracy, maybe go with you first.
Sure. Yeah. And just to kind of play off of that last question, I think one of the things that we're seeing some change in the world is moving away from this idea that you go to therapy because there's something wrong with you, to think of it more like you would go to therapy to help cope with the stuff that's going on because there isn't anything wrong with you. That's part of trying to live a complicated life that we all have in the world. So to this point around, particularly people who come with a language barrier or from other cultures, but I think even domestically or in the United States, we're starting to understand, not starting to, because some people live their whole lives with this understanding that there are a lot of different perspectives that don't get represented in our mainstream culture. Counseling centers have a very strong ethic within them historically, and within a center, how important it is to center the clinical experience with an understanding of the person who's coming into therapy. So while that might not mean that they can speak every language of the native language of a person who's coming in, clinicians are trained to understand that it's so important to pay attention to what's it like to be a person who's trying to live in the United States and speak a language that's not your language. That's a different kind of stress in addition to being in graduate school, and making space for that in the therapy experience. Or what's it like to be a person of color and being the only brown-skinned person in your cohort, and making space in therapy, either to talk directly about that or to make it so that it would be safe to say something about it if that were to be an issue that the client wants to talk about. So lots of counseling centers have staff who come from other countries or have a focus on being an international student coming to the United States, being an international graduate student. At my institution, I have the benefit of supporting both our international student support services team and our counseling center, and they do a lot of collaboration. So another thing we haven't talked about is just kind of noticing on your campus, are there programs or resources that are partnerships between offices? And that's not therapy always, it's usually not therapy, but it could be like a program where you're learning about how do I manage stress as a person who's newly, coming to the United States and also being a graduate student. We didn't talk about that before when we were talking about things that aren't therapy. It's important, I think, to note that a lot of universities do that work.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Tracy, that's an excellent point. There's student organizations, there's clubs, there's, groups, LGBTQ, international students, people, BIPOC. I mean, there are communities of caring and connection outside of your department that really, really can be quite supportive. One other thing I would just say about international students, and not just for international students, but when you go to the counseling center and nobody looks like you, and there's counseling centers do the best they can, but they're never going to be able to meet the need and have representation of every single, person on campus that may want their services. But one thing that certainly we've seen during the pandemic become increasingly popular is teletherapy. And I think more and more universities are going to continue to offer teletherapy as an option and partner with outside vendors for that service, many of whom have the focus of providing a much broader array of people who speak different languages, who are from different cultures. So I think that is a very promising practice that will really help to address this issue.
Thank you. We touched on that earlier. Some students might feel, okay, someone could see me walking over to the mental health center, and they might not feel comfortable doing that. Which advice would you have for those individuals that are looking for resources in the local community instead of the campus resources? And Nance, maybe we go with you first.
Sure. Yeah. First, I would check to see if there is a care manager on your campus, or if the counseling center offers that service. Navigating what the resources that are out there is, it's like doing your taxes. I mean, it's not an easy thing. And especially if you're trying to deal with insurance, who's on my plan, who's not on my plan, how much do I have to pay? I mean, it's not easy. So if there is someone on your campus who can help you wade through some of those sort of daunting questions, that's the first place to start, is to see if there's counseling center folks that do that, perform that service, and or care managers on your campus. If there isn't, that all hope is not lost. For those of you who do have insurance, you would go to the website on your insurance plan, and you can sort for, who's within your area, who accepts your plan. The key, however, is once you actually have a phone conversation, is to be clear to ask, what is the wait time? What are their fees? Do they accept your insurance? Do they have a sliding scale? What is their experience with whatever the issue is that you're bringing to the table? So to remember that you're the consumer and you're purchasing a service. And so just as if you were going to buy a car, you want to know, what kind of mileage does it get? How much is it going to cost me? What's the insurance like? Be prepared with your set of questions, and also do some shopping. You may find, again, you walk into a car dealership, you're probably not going to buy the first car you see. You may, but it's important to have a goodness of fit more than anything else. If you don't feel comfortable with the person, if you don't get a sense of rapport, probably the therapy isn't going to progress in a positive direction. So sometimes it takes, check out 2 or 3, you're not going to do 20, but, maybe 3 different providers, and see, who do I feel, that I have the best fit with. So again, to remember that, you're in the driver's seat here. So ask all of your questions. If you can get help from school, that is great. Another place that can be very helpful is either the health center on campus, or if you have your own family physician or personal physician, they can also be a tremendous resource in helping you find a provider in the community.
Excellent advice. Tracy, would you like to add anything?
In some places, the community mental health center of the local community can be another resource. In a lot of places, they're just as busy or busier than private practice clinicians, and it can be difficult to get in. But that may be another place to look as well, particularly if you are finding that finances are a challenge. Because just to be frank about it, therapy in the private community is expensive. And, hopefully you have insurance that helps you with that. But, and then I guess the other piece to go back to to really reinforce this point, I think that counseling centers that have that person who can help you identify and navigate through finding a therapist in the community are going to be working more often with a set of providers who they work with pretty regularly. And those are therapists who are already saying, I'm comfortable with working with the kinds of issues that graduate students come in with. It's one of the pitches I often make about why it's good to stay with, as a starting point, with the resources on campus, because they're experts in working with college students and graduate students. But the same could be said for finding therapists who work more closely with the university community too.
And Tracy, just to reiterate something you said a few minutes ago, the training clinics on campus can also be really quite valuable. They're not in the counseling center. It could be, the psychiatry department, the residents are in training, or the psychology department. And not to really shy, some people will say, oh, I don't want a trainee. I want someone, they are supervised, really well supervised, and actually can offer really quite a high quality experience.
I had therapy from a therapy trainee, and it was amazing. So that's my own. I had it, and it was great.
Well, sometimes they're more on their toes because they know they're being supervised.
So regardless if it's an on or off campus mental health resource, very often therapists might point to group therapy. Could you talk very briefly about the general benefits and possible downsides of going to a group therapy session? And Tracy, you were nodding so nicely. Would you like to start?
Sure. As a therapist, it's my favorite way to work. And one of the reasons why, and what I would recommend about it is, while many people might experience at first a little bit of a heightened anxiety of like, oh no, other people will be there, they're going to hear what I'm talking about. It is incredibly valuable and healing for many people to have the experience of talking about what's going on with them and having other people say, yeah, me too. Or being able to get support or offer support to other people. It just really allows you to have kind of this broader experience where you're getting support from a therapist, but you're also regularly getting outside of your own head with whatever it is that's going on. As I mentioned before, I led a graduate student therapy group for many, many years. And that, and while every once in a while there were people from the same program, mostly it was people from other programs coming together, and they would regularly reflect on how valuable it was to hear like, oh, in your department, there's some similar kind of challenge that, while I thought maybe it was only me, other people are experiencing that too. That's just it's hard to replace that when you're talking with a therapist by yourself, because therapy is meant to be, therapy with an individual therapist is meant to be a safe place and is focused on what's going on for the individual, which means you don't get to hear, oh yeah, I struggled with that too, most of the time. It's focused on you, but group therapy allows you also to listen and focus on other people. So that's some of the highlights I would say of why it's so important.
Yeah, I think, the fact that you have the experience, it's a shared experience. Your story may be different, and what you're bringing to the group may be, your own thing. But the fact that you are not alone, and that there is sort of a shared exchange. And to your point, Tracy, you can benefit from not only what the therapist or the facilitator has to say, but all of the other people in your group. I mean, they may have some very sound advice, things that have worked for them in the past, that may or may not work for you, but, hearing about other people's ways of coping and strategies that they've used can also be quite helpful and informative. And so you benefit from the wisdom and knowledge of many people instead of just the clinician that you're working with in an individual scenario.
I thought of one other point about group therapy as a comparatively beneficial is that in a lot of counseling centers, group therapy doesn't have a session limit attached to it. So if you are looking for a more ongoing experience and you'd like to stay in your university counseling center, group therapy can be a way to do that.
Thank you. I think we received so many questions from the audience prior to this webinar and now during the webinar, and I definitely would like to touch on two topics. First, interactions with a faculty advisor, right? If you really realize that you are at your limits and you have mental health challenges, for example, you might need more time, you're aware you might need actually time to talk to friends, to take a couple of days off. It is very often hard to have that frank conversation with a faculty advisor. Is there anything in your professional opinion how students should prepare for those kind of conversations, and how can you make sure that this conversation doesn't impact the working relationship moving forward? And Nancy, I'm curious what your thoughts are on this very difficult topic, actually.
Yeah, again, I'm a strong advocate for being transparent and forthright and not shy about advocating for yourself, whether it's with your mentor, your PI, a faculty member at large, whomever. I think that, and I'm very curious to hear the webinar with faculty and administrators that you did in part one, because one of the primary recommendations that came out of the report that we've been referencing is the importance for education and training for faculty, for PIs, for mentors on how to mentor the whole student. And not just focusing on their academics, their research, their grants, what have you. And that is a shift. And some people do that naturally, but many people do not. And so I can imagine as a graduate student having a PI or a faculty member who's one of those people who are not naturally open to these kinds of conversations. It's still important to have the conversation, as hard as it may be. And if you do not feel that it was well received, don't stop there. You need to go to your provost, you need to go to your graduate student dean, you need to go to whomever the next sort of level up is to ensure that you are heard. And in fact, if you need accommodations, you need some time away, whether that's the accommodations office, the disability office, the ADA office, whatever they're called, accessibility offices on many campuses now. And one of the other things we also have focused on that needs changing is leave policies, really needing to modify what happens when a student needs to take some time away, because we want to encourage that. We want people, that's a positive sign to know, to be wise enough to know that you need to take some time away to benefit for your own mental health or physical well-being. And so that's a challenge in graduate school. Most graduate students are on a research fellowship, a paid project, or they're working on experiments that you can't just leave for 6 months. So really rethinking policies, are there ways to maintain your stipend and do just the work that you need to do to keep your project moving, or whatever creative solutions. We have quite a few in the report, but I'm going off a little bit on a tangent because I think we need to change the system in order to make that conversation for a student to have with their PI something that's more of a no-brainer. Like, of course, I should be able to talk about that. And I think the reality is that's not truly the case, now in many instances, but doesn't mean to say you shouldn't have it. And if you don't get the results that you need, or you feel like there's been resistance or you're not getting the support, to talk to someone else.
Excellent. So one other question which came up over and over was related to the pandemic and COVID. A lot of graduate students had their first year starting during the pandemic, and reflecting on your own experiences and also the experiences you heard from other graduate students and other faculty, which advice would you have for students that really started during a pandemic and struggle to build those networks, to find their social environment which energizes and provides this warm feeling being part of a community that has one goal to advance research in their subdiscipline. Is there anything what you could share with graduate students or postdocs who are in that group? And Tracy, I would start with you.
I guess the first thing that comes to mind is take advantage of the opportunity of the cycle of the academic calendar. So for most of our campuses, we are hearing about plans for the fall. And so that lends itself to kind of an opportunity for, if not a reset, what does it look like to turn the page to the next thing? And so for a student who started their program for the most part back in August, and maybe everything was remote, it might be going to someone in the department, your PI, whoever the team might be, to say, let's take advantage of this opportunity as a reset to be intentional about how would we bring our cohort together? Or if it's not something that you could do within your department, maybe it's something you could do with a graduate student council of some sort, if you have the bandwidth to do that in a broader way. But take advantage of the opportunity to talk about it and ask for it, and bring it up as something, because I will just say I spend a lot of time with faculty who have experienced a loss around that as well. Most faculty really appreciate and value the mentorship relationship that they develop with their students, and that's been curtailed by everything being remote on a lot of campuses. So some of you may have moved to the area where you're going to school, and so you've been kind of sitting in an apartment by yourself and not being able to make those connections. Some of you have not, and so you've been taking those classes or doing that work remotely. So try to just take this again as an opportunity to say, all right, so chapter 2 of graduate school, it's going to be different. And so what do I need to do to add in, to really build in the experience to make it more what I'm looking for, and create connections to my peers and to the university in a way where you get to be part of that fabric. And the fact that you want that is a really good thing, I would say, even though it can feel hard because we're coming out of this, or still struggling with, in a lot of parts of the country, a pandemic that's making it hard for us to just sort of like go out there and meet people spontaneously the way you might have relied on that before.
I would just say one other thing about that, and this is something, if you will, positive about the pandemic that I hope we've learned and we hold on to when we get back to quote normal. And that is, to your point a little bit, Tracy, everyone has been struggling.
Yeah.
So the struggles that you may have been having as a graduate student are probably many of the same struggles your faculty or mentors are having. How are they balancing, maybe having young children at home that need help with Zoom schooling, or an aging parent, or a person who's lost a partner who's lost their job, or whatever it might be. And I think not that those are good things, but the value that comes from that I hope we don't lose is, again, this understanding of ultimately graduate students, but all of us as whole people, as a full being that has many, many demands on our time and our energy. And we've all been through that. So I'm hoping that we don't forget that when we go back to campus, and that we're more patient and generous and understanding, especially when people are having these challenges. So.
Then, Tracy, I could continue talking to you for hours, but time is flying. So we are almost at the very end, and we have still many, many questions. So dear audience, be aware that we are thinking already about other events which we could provide to graduate students. It could be another conversation with Nance and Tracy, and other maybe smaller formats where we have a group conversation. Stay attuned. We will send you a message as soon as we have another event scheduled. But at this point, I would like to thank so much Tracy Calandretto and Nance Roy for being with us today as speakers. And as we adjourn, I would like to turn it once more to Nance and to Tracy for one specific and wonderful piece of advice for graduate students that are seeking to maintain their mental well-being. And let's go with Nance first.
So I did have one other thing I wanted to say, and we could probably talk forever too, so it's a good thing that you're timing us. And I will say, I meant to say this earlier, when Tracy was talking about group therapy, help giving can be very, very therapeutic, as much sometimes as help receiving. And so as graduate students, also remember the position that you are in as a role model for undergraduates that you teach or mentor in some way. And just as you were asking, other questions were, how would I talk to my PI if I were struggling? Educate yourselves, get education on how would I notice a sign of struggle in someone that I might be teaching or supervising? How would I reach out? Do I know where to connect them for services? Balancing, being a role model of balancing life and work. It can be incredibly powerful, and certainly not only for the people that you're instructing, but also for you, to be someone who is sensitive and help giving and caring. So I invite you to think about your own role that you can play in promoting well-being broadly.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me today. And again, good luck moving forward.
Thank you. Tracy?
Well, this might sound a little corny, but I guess the thing that I would leave you all with is treat yourself as the human being that you are. And to understand that that can be uncomfortable, and you might wish that you weren't having a feeling, or you might wish that something wasn't difficult for you, but creating space in yourself to be a human being, to laugh, to have fun, to sleep, to exercise, to eat some yummy food, to listen to a song that you like, doesn't stop being important, regardless of what else you have going on, and to honor that in yourself, and to strive for balance is really important. So, and I also want to say thank you for all of the important work that you all are doing. I think that the importance and the gratitude that we have, at least here in the United States, for the sciences, I hope is something that we're doing a little bit more, but it's really, you're doing important work, and thank you for that.
Thank you, Tracy, and thank you, Nance, for being with us today. I think I learned a lot today, and I can't wait for our next session. Audience, thank you for joining, and I hope to see you at the next webinar. All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.